what kind of person would you want beside you in a military crisis? Someone who is fearless enough to rush straight in, or someone who is cautious enough to be hesitant? In the Analects of Confucius 7.11, Confucius's answer is actually quite startling. In any situation in which there will be serious consequences, he actually wants someone who is afraid, not reckless, not paralyzed either, but just afraid enough to come up with a plan. And yeah, let's get straight into it. 7.11, the master said to Yan Hui, only the two of us are able to act when we are employed and to live in reclusion when we are not wanted. Zilu said, but if you were to lead the 3 armies of Lu, whom would you take with you? The master responded, I wouldn't take anyone who would try to wrestle a tiger with his bare hands or walk across the Yellow River. Not someone who goes to his death without regrets. If I were to take anyone, it would have to be someone who faces the task ahead with some trepidation and who is good at planning and good at bringing the mission to a successful end. Okay, this is a pretty long chapter relatively, but we'll just break it down little by little. And so we'll be starting first with to get to know a bit about the people in this passage. So first of all, to clear anything up first, the master is Confucius, by the way. And Yan Hui was Confucius's, probably is arguably his favorite disciple, although that isn't very explicitly stated. But Confucius does praise him a lot for his really steadfastness to learning and sticking to the way despite external circumstances. And then there's Zilu, who was an energetic and ambitious and courageous disciple of Confucius, who can often be a bit too rash. And in the passages so far that we've encountered him, he has often been criticized, kind of, by Confucius about not having courage paired with wisdom, which is very, very important. Just before we start breaking down the words and the phrases of this passage, here's just a quick overview. So Confucius praises Yan Hui for the ability to act when he is needed and to humbly step back when he is not needed. And then Zilu steps in to the conversation, asking Confucius who he would take with him if he was in charge of the army of Lu, which is the state of Lu that Confucius grew up in. And so nobody actually knows why Zilu decided to randomly switch the conversation to military action. But ancient commentaries like the Kong Anguo commentary suggests that perhaps Zilu, after hearing about Confucius praising Yan Hui, thought that maybe being able to act and step back is Yan Hui's ability or something that he's good at. But surely Zilu's, the thing that he's good at is his courage. And so he thought surely if Confucius was in charge of the entire military, then he would want Zilu to be at his side. So he tried to ask this question, but maybe also wanted to know the true definition of courage, which he is so good at, apparently. And this matches with what we saw in the Analects of Confucius 5.1, which is about basically Zilu was very, very excited to hear that Confucius thought that Zilu would accompany Confucius if he were to go on a boat across the sea, but not just for adventure, which is what Zilu thought, but instead it was actually for something a lot more melancholy, probably something about how disappointed he was in the state of the world. But Zilu, after hearing that, was very, very excited because he only heard the part about going on an adventure. And then Confucius, at the same time, kind of criticizes him for only having courage but not having enough wisdom to plan. Kind of like we're going to see here. And yeah, going down, breaking down everything, not everything, but let's start first with only the two of us are able to act when we are employed. So act can mean just entering service or putting one's abilities or the way into effect, and employed is just being put into use. And to live in reclusion when we are not wanted. So this word in Chinese is literally hide, but not in the cowardly way, but just being in reserves or just keeping one's abilities in reserves so that if you're needed again, then you can still have your abilities. Just because your abilities aren't being put into action, it doesn't mean that you should absolutely just give up on them. So yes, it's like withdrawing without abandoning your inner character, and it's also not spending your capabilities into the wrong places. And a modern example of this, maybe you've gone through this, is that you're in the student government or student council or something like that, and you were in it, you served a pretty good term, and you've served the people a lot because that's just what you want to do. You want to help people and the school and the community. But then you're not reelected. And so if you're not reelected, then you would humbly step back from office without giving up the capabilities or the commitments that you had made or done during your term, because that's what made the work actually matter, and you really shouldn't be giving up those qualities of you just because you're not really actually putting them into action anymore. Because first of all, they're useful, and second of all, they just contribute to you being a better person. And basically the phrase, when we are not wanted, is just basically the opposite of employed. I'll go to that in more detail later. So then Zilu says, but if you were to lead the 3 armies of Lu, which is just the military forces of a major state during that time, and the 3 armies could be interpreted as the ranks, in which they're separated into upper, middle, and lower ranks. And then he says, whom would you take with you? So it's just, what kind of person would you want to work alongside? And the master responded, I wouldn't take anyone who would try to wrestle a tiger with his bare hands or walk across the Yellow River. So this phrase of wrestling a tiger with your bare hands or walking across the river, not really Yellow River, that's just implied, or that's just, I guess, an interpretation that the translation made, but no Yellow River, just river in general. This is actually a pre-existing phrase or saying that was pretty popular back then, and it has showed up in the minor odes of the Book of Odes, and specifically the Book of Odes in the minor odes in Ode 195 in the final stanza. If you would like, I put it in the description. So yeah, so just walk across the Yellow River is like you don't have a boat and you just try to walk across the river, even though, of course, it's not shallow enough for you to walk across. Well, some rivers are like that. And also wrestling a tiger with your bare hands, of course, that's not a very good idea. And you shouldn't even be wrestling a tiger in the first place, especially not when you're not really armed. So yeah, reckless and unnecessary risks. And then not someone who goes to his death without regrets. If I were to take anyone, it would have to be someone who faces the task ahead with trepidation. So trepidation is basically just a fearful anticipation, and who is good at planning and good at bringing the mission to a successful end. So Confucius doesn't want someone who is reckless, and instead he wants someone who is actually afraid enough, not too afraid so much that they are paralyzed and they freeze up and they're like, oh no, I don't want to do this, and just runs away. But someone who is afraid enough to know how serious this is and to understand the serious consequences, and someone who understands these consequences and the seriousness of this task can successfully come up with a plan that will most likely work. So diving into the first sentence with more context, during the late spring and autumn period in which Confucius lived in, men of service could seek to be appointed with rulers or aristocratic families as advisors or administrators or something like that. And so in this passage, employed could mean public service, but earlier in ancient commentaries also suggest that it could be as a time when action can be carried out, in which if the external circumstances or the rulers allow an action to be carried out, then you carry it out. If the external circumstances don't allow you to carry it out, then you don't, and you just hold back, and also at the same time not giving up your capabilities or forcing action to happen. However, this doesn't mean that whatever circumstances permit is correct, because situations could allow you to act badly. And instead, a good action is a fitting action instead of something that is possible but isn't necessarily morally correct. And it could be also about what ritual propriety teaches us. Like, for example, reacting to certain circumstances and really knowing how to correctly act in a circumstance or in a situation. So this can also be about timeliness and knowing when a situation calls for action and when it doesn't. So in a more broader sense, this is acting when an action is fitting and withdrawing when forced action is futile or just bad, and trying to not compromise your moral character in either condition. And moving on to the second thing that Confucius says, which is his response to Zilu's question, it seems as though his question was more like whether or not courage is the absolute absence of fear, or fear that is shaped into deliberate and responsible action. So this lesson, this response actually seems to be more of a tailored lesson for Zilu, which Confucius often does as tailored lessons, more than a universal rule for good leadership. In situations like a military crisis, in which actions and decisions can determine the lives of a lot of people, or maybe just some people, or maybe just you, then, and error can be really dangerous, Confucius values more someone who can think carefully and come up with a plan and actually execute it successfully, rather than someone who doesn't worry about anything at all and therefore doesn't think at all and charge in blindly without any plans. So he's not criticizing courage, he's not criticizing bravery, he just values seriousness in serious times. And yeah, that'll be all today. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!